I never thought I'd be afraid in my own home. At 55, after surviving an abusive marriage and raising my son Marcus alone, I believed my battles were over. I thought the hardest part of my life was behind me. The sleepless nights when he was sick, the overtime shifts to pay for his school clothes, the tears I cried in empty parking lots so he wouldn't see me break. I thought I had earned my peace. But sitting here now, clutching my Bible with hands that won't stop shaking, I realize that sometimes the cruelest wounds come from the people we love most. Sometimes the very child you sacrificed everything for becomes the storm you can't escape. Marcus moved back home 6 months ago after losing his job. At first, I was grateful. My little boy was coming home, and maybe we could rebuild what years of struggle had worn thin between us. I cleaned out the guest room, bought his favorite snacks, even let him use my car whenever he needed it. I thought this was God's way of bringing us closer. I was wrong. It started small. Eye rolls when I said grace before dinner, heavy sighs when I mentioned church, little comments about how I was getting too old for fairy tales. I told myself it was just stress from unemployment, that he didn't mean to hurt me. I made excuses because that's what mothers do. We protect our children, even when they stop protecting us. But the comments grew sharper. "Mom, you're embarrassing yourself with all this religious nonsense," he'd say, watching me read my Bible at the kitchen table. "People are going to think you've lost your mind." When I tried to explain that my faith had carried me through the darkest times of my life, he'd just laugh. Not the warm laughter I remembered from his childhood, but something cold and cutting. The worst part wasn't the mockery. It was watching my own son look at me like I was a burden he couldn't wait to shed. The same boy I used to rock to sleep was now treating me like an unwelcome stranger in my own house. Every morning I'd wake up hoping yesterday's cruelty had been a bad dream, but every day it got worse. I started praying quietly in my bedroom with the door closed, but even that wasn't enough. He'd pound on the wall when he heard me whispering my prayers, shouting for me to keep it down, in language that made my heart break. This was my home too, the home I'd worked 3 jobs to keep when his father abandoned us. But somehow, I'd become the intruder. If you're watching this story and feeling that familiar ache of recognition, please subscribe to our channel. We're trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and sharing these stories helps other women know they're not alone. Please comment and tell me what city you're watching from. Knowing you're there gives me strength to keep sharing. Last Sunday morning, I was getting ready for church when Marcus appeared in my bedroom doorway. I was straightening my Sunday dress, the navy blue one with tiny flowers that made me feel dignified, when I saw his reflection in my mirror. His face was twisted with something I'd never seen before, something that made my blood run cold. "You're not going anywhere," he said, blocking my path to the door. "I'm tired of you coming home and filling this house with your religious garbage. Tired of you praying loud enough for the neighbors to hear. You're making us both look crazy." I tried to explain that church was important to me, that it was where I found peace and community, but he just shook his head. "Find peace somewhere else. Or better yet, find somewhere else to live. I'm thinking about selling this house anyway. Selling the house. My house. The home I'd nearly killed myself to keep when he was young, working double shifts while he slept safely in his bed. The place where I'd nursed him through fevers, celebrated his graduations, prayed over his future. Now he was talking about selling it like it was just another piece of property. That's when I understood. This wasn't about religion or noise or embarrassment. This was about power. About a grown man who couldn't control his own life trying to control mine. About someone who'd forgotten that respect flows both ways, even between mothers and sons. But I was still his mother. And mothers, well, we're taught to endure, to forgive, to keep loving even when love feels like drowning. So I stepped back from the door and missed church that day, telling myself it was just easier to avoid conflict, that if I just gave him space, he'd remember who I was, who we used to be. I should have known that giving ground to cruelty only invites more cruelty. That silence, when faced with abuse, sounds like permission to those who want to hurt you. I should have known that my real test of faith was just beginning. The weeks that followed felt like walking on glass in my own home. Every step I took seemed to cut deeper. Every breath I drew felt borrowed. Marcus had claimed the living room as his territory, spreading his belongings across surfaces I used to keep neat and orderly. His job applications sat scattered on my dining table, the same table where I'd helped him with homework every night for 12 years. And when I gently asked if he could move them so I could eat dinner, he looked at me like I'd asked him to move mountains. "This is important, Mom. More important than whatever you're doing." He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Besides, you can eat in the kitchen. It's not like you're entertaining guests." Not entertaining guests. The words stung because they were true. Over the years, I'd lost touch with most of my friends. When you're working multiple jobs and raising a child alone, friendships become luxuries you can't afford. The few church friends I had felt distant now. How could I invite them over when my own son made it clear I was unwelcome in my own space? I started eating my meals standing at the kitchen counter, like a servant in my own home. Small concessions that felt necessary to keep peace. But each one chipped away another piece of who I used to be. I told myself it was temporary, that once Marcus found work, things would go back to normal. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that normal was never coming back. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. I was in my bedroom, door closed, whispering my evening prayers when I heard his footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, deliberate, angry. They stopped right outside my door, and for a moment, the house was completely silent. Then came the pounding. "What did I tell you about that noise?" His voice carried through the thin door like a threat. "I have an interview tomorrow, and I need to sleep. Your mumbling is keeping me awake." I wasn't mumbling loudly. I knew I wasn't. I'd been whispering so quietly I could barely hear myself. But I opened the door anyway, hoping to reason with him, to explain that prayer was how I found peace at the end of difficult days. The Marcus standing in my hallway wasn't the boy I'd raised. This was someone else entirely. Someone whose eyes held a coldness that made my stomach clench with fear. He was bigger than me now, had been for years, but I'd never noticed how much bigger until he was standing over me, using his size like a weapon. "I don't care what you call it," he said, stepping closer until I had to back into my own room. "I don't care if it's prayer or meditation or talking to your imaginary friend. You're going to stop, or I'm going to make you stop. Make me stop." The words hung in the air between us like a physical threat. This was my son, the baby I'd carried for 9 months, the toddler I'd chased around playgrounds, the teenager I'd driven to soccer practice every weekend for 4 years. But the person standing in front of me felt like a stranger wearing my son's face. "Marcus, this is my house too," I said, surprised by how small my voice sounded. "I have a right to—" "Your house?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Who's been paying the bills since I moved back? Who's been buying groceries? You think your minimum wage job at the gift shop covers this mortgage?" He was right, and we both knew it. Since he'd moved back, he'd been contributing more financially than I could. His unemployment benefits were more than my part-time wages, and he'd been using that fact like a club to beat me into submission. Money had become his weapon of choice, and I was defenseless against it. "I raised you in this house," I whispered, hating how weak I sounded. "I worked 3 jobs to keep it when your father left us with nothing. This is my home." "That was then," he said, moving even closer. "This is now. And right now, I'm the one keeping this place running. So if I say no more religious nonsense, that's exactly what I mean." I wanted to fight back. Every fiber of my being screamed that this was wrong, that children don't get to dictate terms to their parents, that respect flows both ways regardless of who pays which bills. But I was tired, bone deep, soul-crushing tired. Tired of fighting for space in my own life. Tired of justifying my existence to someone who used to think I hung the moon. So I nodded. I closed my bedroom door and put my Bible away in the nightstand drawer, shoving it under old magazines like it was something shameful. I stopped my evening prayers, at least the spoken ones. I learned to pray silently, wordlessly, moving my lips without sound like I was sharing secrets with the air. But even that wasn't enough for Marcus. He seemed to sense when I was praying, appearing at the most inconvenient moments to interrupt, to remind me that even my thoughts weren't private anymore. He'd knock on my door asking for trivial things, where I kept the spare light bulbs, whether I'd seen his phone charger, if I knew when the trash pickup was, always during the quiet moments when I was trying to find peace. The isolation was the cruelest part. Marcus had effectively cut me off from the two things that had sustained me through my darkest years, my faith and my home. I couldn't practice my religion openly, couldn't invite friends over, couldn't even move freely through my own house without calculating whether my presence would irritate him. I started walking through the neighborhood in the evenings, just to escape the suffocating atmosphere he'd created. I'd pass houses where families were having dinner together, where porch lights glowed warm and welcoming, where children played in yards while parents watched with obvious love and pride. Those glimpses of normal family life felt like looking through windows into a world I'd never be allowed to enter. The worst part was the guilt. Here I was, a grown woman complaining about her son when other mothers would give anything to have their children living at home again. Marcus wasn't on drugs, wasn't stealing from me, wasn't bringing dangerous people into my house. He was just mean, controlling, cold, and somehow that felt like something I should be able to handle, something I should be grateful for compared to what other parents endured. But gratitude was becoming harder to find every day, and I was beginning to understand that sometimes the absence of obvious abuse doesn't mean the presence of love. Sometimes quiet cruelty cuts deeper than loud violence, because it leaves you questioning whether you have the right to call it cruelty at all. I started changing everything about myself to keep the peace. It was gradual at first, small adjustments that seemed reasonable when viewed individually, but devastating when added together. I stopped humming hymns while doing housework. I hid my Bible deeper in the nightstand drawer, burying it under old photo albums and forgotten letters. I even changed my clothes, avoiding the modest dresses and cardigans that Marcus said made me look like some church lady from the 1950s. The person staring back at me in the mirror each morning looked increasingly unfamiliar. Without my usual Sunday dress and the quiet confidence that came from regular worship, I felt diminished somehow, smaller, like I was disappearing piece by piece, and no one, not even I, seemed to notice or care. Marcus noticed everything, though. He had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect any sign of my faith, like a bloodhound tracking prey. If I lingered too long looking at a church flyer that came in the mail, he'd snatch it away with an exaggerated sigh. "More junk mail," he'd say, tossing it in the trash with theatrical disgust. When are these people going to learn that not everyone wants to be bothered with their fairy tales? The word fairy tales became his favorite weapon. He'd use it whenever he caught me doing anything that reminded him of my beliefs. Reading inspirational quotes on social media, watching a movie with religious themes, even listening to gospel music on the radio while cooking. "Turn off those fairy tales, Mom. They're giving me a headache." I tried explaining that faith wasn't about fairy tales, that my beliefs had sustained me through his father's abandonment, through years of financial struggle, through the loneliness of single motherhood. But Marcus would just shake his head like I was a child clinging to Santa Claus, his expression a mixture of pity and irritation that cut deeper than outright anger. "You use religion as a crutch," he said one morning, watching me make coffee with hands that shook slightly from anxiety I could no longer hide. "Successful people don't need imaginary friends to get through life. They take control and make things happen." The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was my unemployed son, living in my house rent-free, lecturing me about taking control of life, but pointing out contradictions had become dangerous territory. Any challenge to his authority, no matter how gentle, would trigger hours of cold silence or worse, verbal attacks that left me feeling like I'd been emotionally flayed. The grocery store became my refuge. Working at the little gift shop attached to the local grocery store meant I could spend 8 hours a day around normal people having normal conversations about normal things. My coworkers were kind, mostly older women like myself who understood what it meant to work because you had to, not because you wanted to. They'd ask about Marcus sometimes, proud of me for having raised a son who'd turned out so well. I learned to lie with a smile. "Oh, he's doing great. Still looking for the right opportunity. You know how the job market is these days." The words felt like ash in my mouth. But what was the alternative? Admit that my adult son was slowly destroying me from the inside out? Confess that I was afraid in my own home? Nobody wants to hear that kind of truth, especially not at work. But the lies were getting harder to maintain. Marcus had started calling me at work. not to check on me or share good news about job prospects, but to criticize things I'd done or forgotten to do around the house. "The dishes in the sink are gross," he'd say, his voice carrying clearly through the phone. "I shouldn't have to clean up after you when I'm dealing with my own stress." My coworkers would glance over sympathetically, assuming they were overhearing normal family dynamics. If only they knew that those calls were calculated reminders of my place in the hierarchy he'd established. Each public humiliation was designed to reinforce the message that I was failing as a mother, as a housekeeper, as a human being worth basic respect. The worst incident happened on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I'd been having lunch in the break room, finally relaxing for 30 precious minutes, when Marcus called. This time, he was furious about something I couldn't even understand at first. Apparently, I'd moved his laptop charger while cleaning and he'd spent 20 minutes looking for it. "I told you not to touch my stuff," he said, his voice loud enough that everyone in the break room could hear. "I'm trying to prepare for interviews, and you're sabotaging me by moving things around. How am I supposed to get a job when my own mother is working against me?" I tried to explain quietly that I'd only moved the charger 6 inches to wipe down the counter, that it was sitting right where he'd left it, just in a slightly different position. But Marcus wasn't interested in explanations. He wanted an audience for my humiliation, and my coworkers were providing exactly that. "You're getting old, Mom," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone of patient condescension that made my stomach clench. "Your memory isn't what it used to be. Maybe you should consider whether you're still capable of living independently." The break room had gone completely silent. 5 women who'd known me for 3 years were listening to my son question my mental competency over a phone charger that had been moved 6 inches. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, felt tears threaten behind my eyes, felt something inside me crack like ice under too much weight. "I have to go," I whispered into the phone. "I'm at work." "Yeah, well, think about what I said. Maybe it's time to make some changes around here." He hung up, leaving me sitting in a room full of women who were trying very hard to pretend they hadn't just heard my adult son speak to me like I was a confused elderly patient in need of supervision. The silence stretched until Martha, who'd worked at the store longer than anyone, gently touched my arm. "Honey," she said softly, "is everything okay at home?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline I was too ashamed to grab. How could I explain that the child I'd sacrificed everything for was slowly erasing me? How could I admit that I was being systematically broken down in my own home by someone who used to bring me dandelions picked from the yard, who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world? "He's just stressed about the job search," I said, forcing a smile that felt like broken glass. "You know how it is." But Martha's eyes told me she knew. She knew that stress didn't explain cruelty, that unemployment didn't justify emotional abuse, that something was very wrong in my life, and her knowing made everything worse, because it meant the facade I'd been maintaining was crumbling, and soon everyone would see what I'd become. A woman so diminished by her own son that she couldn't even defend herself in public. That night, I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, trying to gather enough strength to face whatever mood Marcus would be in. The house that had once been my sanctuary now felt like a prison, and I was beginning to understand that some prisons don't have bars. They have family members who've forgotten that love is supposed to lift you up, not tear you down. The darkness came gradually, like winter settling over my soul one cold day at a time. By November, I had stopped fighting entirely. The woman who used to hum while folding laundry, who found joy in small morning rituals, who believed that tomorrow could be better than today, that woman had been carefully dismantled piece by piece until only a hollow shell remained. I moved through my own house like a ghost, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I learned to time my showers for when Marcus was out, to eat my meals quickly in the kitchen while standing, to watch television only when he was in his room with the door closed. The living room, with its comfortable couch and good lighting, had become his domain entirely. I was a visitor in spaces I'd once called my own. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to every sound, cataloging Marcus's moods by the weight of his footsteps, the force with which he closed doors, the tone of his voice during phone calls that drifted through the thin walls. Heavy steps meant anger about something I'd done wrong. Doors slamming meant I should avoid him entirely. Loud phone calls meant he was complaining about me to someone, describing my failings with the casual cruelty of someone discussing a broken appliance that needed to be replaced. The nightmares started around this time. I'd dream that I was trapped in rooms that kept shrinking, or that I was calling for help, but no sound would come from my throat. Sometimes I'd dream about Marcus as a little boy, running toward me with his arms outstretched, his face bright with love and trust. Those dreams were the cruelest ones, because I'd wake up believing for a moment that we could go back to who we used to be, only to remember that the loving child from my dreams had grown into a man who seemed to find genuine pleasure in my pain. The holidays were approaching, and the thought filled me with dread instead of anticipation. How could I pretend to celebrate gratitude and family togetherness when I felt neither grateful nor part of a family? Marcus had made it clear that any holiday traditions involving prayer or acknowledgement of faith were off limits. "We're not doing any of that religious stuff this year," he announced while I was planning our Thanksgiving menu. "Just a normal dinner, like normal people." Normal people. As if my beliefs made me abnormal, defective, embarrassing. I wondered what he thought normal meant. A house where the son controlled every aspect of his mother's existence? Where love had been replaced by financial leverage and emotional manipulation? Where a woman who'd given her whole life to raising her child now tiptoed through her days like an unwelcome boarder? I stopped calling my few remaining friends entirely. What would I say? How could I explain that the boy they remembered bringing cookies to their children, the teenager they'd watched graduate with pride, had become someone I barely recognized? They'd ask questions I couldn't answer without admitting how completely I'd failed as a parent, how thoroughly I'd lost control of my own life. The worst part was the silence inside my own head. I'd always been someone who processed difficult times through prayer, through internal conversations with God that helped me find perspective and strength. But months of suppression had quieted even those private communications. It felt like a spiritual drought, as if the source of comfort I'd relied on for 55 years had simply dried up and blown away. One evening in early December, while making dinner that Marcus would probably criticize, I caught my reflection in the window above the kitchen sink. The woman staring back looked ancient, not just older, but worn down in a way that went beyond years. Her shoulders curved inward like she was protecting herself from blows that might come at any moment. Her eyes held a defeat so complete it was difficult to look at directly. That's when I realized I had given up entirely. Not just on fighting back, not just on standing up for myself, but on the basic belief that things could ever be different. I was existing in a state of pure survival, moving from one day to the next without any hope that the future might hold something better than managed misery. The breaking point came on December 15th, a date I'll never forget because it was the day I finally understood how close I'd come to disappearing completely. I was wrapping Marcus's Christmas gifts, expensive items I'd bought with money I couldn't afford, hoping against hope that generosity might somehow rekindle the love I remembered, when he walked into my bedroom without knocking. "What's all this?" he asked, looking at the packages scattered across my bed with obvious irritation. "Christmas presents," I said quietly, automatically apologizing with my tone, even though I'd done nothing wrong. "I got you a few things I thought you might like." Marcus picked up one of the boxes and shook it, his expression unreadable. "How much did you spend?" The question felt like a trap. If I told him the real amount, he'd lecture me about financial irresponsibility. If I lied, he'd probably see through it and use my dishonesty as ammunition for future arguments. So I told the truth, about $300. His face darkened immediately. $300? Are you insane? You're behind on utilities, you can barely afford groceries, and you're throwing money away on Christmas garbage? "It's not garbage," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's Christmas. It's supposed to be about what? About pretending we're some happy family? About acting like everything's fine when you can't even take care of yourself?" He dropped the box back onto the bed with deliberate carelessness. "Take it all back. Return every single thing. I don't want presents from someone who can't afford to buy them." I stared at the packages I'd wrapped so carefully, each one chosen with memories of who Marcus used to be, who I'd hoped he might become again. The paper was perfect. No wrinkles, no tape showing, the corners sharp and clean the way I'd learned to do when he was small, and believed Christmas morning was magical. "Please," I whispered, hating how the words sounded coming from my mouth. "Let me do this one thing. Let me give you Christmas gifts. Let me be your mother for one day." The words hung in the air between us, raw and desperate, and absolutely truthless about what our relationship had become. For a moment, Marcus's expression seemed to soften slightly, and I thought maybe I'd reached some part of him that remembered what we used to mean to each other. Then his face hardened again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a coldness that made my blood freeze. "You stopped being my mother the day you chose your imaginary friend over your real son. Now you're just the old woman who lives in my house and makes my life harder than it needs to be." He left the room, and I collapsed onto the bed among the Christmas presents that would never be given, surrounded by evidence of a love that had become entirely one-sided. The sobs that came felt like they were tearing my chest apart, great wrenching cries that I muffled with a pillow so he wouldn't hear, and find new reasons to criticize me. But even as I cried, even as I felt like I was drowning in grief and despair, something small and fierce flickered to life inside me. Maybe it was the complete finality of his cruelty, or maybe it was the realization that I had nothing left to lose. But for the first time in months, I felt something other than fear and resignation. I still had something they forgot, something that couldn't be taken away by threats or financial control or systematic emotional destruction. I still had a choice about who I wanted to be, even if I'd forgotten that for a while. The change began in the silence of that December night, among the scattered Christmas gifts that would never find their way to loving hands. As I sat surrounded by the wreckage of my hopes, something shifted deep inside me. Not dramatic, not sudden, but quiet and certain, like the first hint of dawn after the longest night. I returned those gifts the next morning, each transaction feeling like a small funeral for the mother I used to be. But as I watched the clerk process each return, as I felt the money flow back into my account, I realized something profound. I was taking action. For the first time in months, I was making a decision based on what I needed rather than what Marcus demanded. It was a tiny victory, almost insignificant in the grand scheme of my diminished life, but tiny victories, I was beginning to understand, were still victories. I started observing instead of just enduring. When Marcus criticized my cooking, I didn't automatically apologize and offer to make something else. Instead, I listened to his words, really listened, and heard not justified complaints, but the angry ranting of someone who'd never learned that other people weren't responsible for his happiness. When he complained about the temperature in the house, the noise from neighbors, the way I folded his laundry, I began to see a pattern of perpetual dissatisfaction that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with his own inability to find contentment. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If Marcus's anger wasn't really about my failures, then all my attempts to become the perfect, invisible, accommodating mother had been pointless. I'd been trying to solve an equation that had no solution, attempting to satisfy someone who found more pleasure in complaint than in gratitude. I started remembering who I used to be before fear became my primary emotion. The woman who'd worked 3 jobs without complaint, who'd attended every soccer game and school play, who'd held her head high even when Marcus's father left us with nothing but debt and broken promises. That woman had been strong, resourceful, capable of surviving anything life threw at her. She was still inside me somewhere, buried under months of accumulated humiliation, but not destroyed. One evening, while Marcus was out at what he claimed was a networking event, I retrieved my Bible from its hiding place in the nightstand drawer. The leather cover felt familiar in my hands, warm and comforting like greeting an old friend after a long separation. I didn't open it immediately. Months of conditioning had made me nervous about being caught with it, but just holding it reminded me of something important. This book had sustained me through my husband's abandonment, through years of financial struggle, through the loneliness of single parenthood and the exhaustion of working multiple jobs. It had been my constant companion during Marcus's difficult teenage years, when love felt like a one-way street, and parenting seemed like an impossible task with no clear instructions. The words inside had given me strength when I had none, hope when despair felt overwhelming, wisdom when I was too tired to think clearly. Marcus couldn't take that away from me. He could control my actions, manipulate my living situation, make my daily life miserable through criticism and emotional abuse. But my inner life, my relationship with the divine, my core beliefs about who I was and what I deserved, those belonged to me alone. I began praying again, but differently this time. Not the desperate, pleading prayers of recent months, begging for Marcus to change or for our relationship to magically repair itself. Instead, I prayed for clarity, for strength, for the wisdom to see my situation as it really was, rather than as I wished it could be. The prayers felt rusty at first, like a language I'd once spoken fluently but had neglected for too long. But gradually, the words came more easily, and with them came a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, and certainly not the illusion that everything would suddenly become easy, but peace, the deep, unshakable knowing that I was not alone, that my life had value beyond what others recognized, that survival was not the same as living. I started keeping a small notebook hidden with my Bible, writing down thoughts and observations that I couldn't share with anyone else. The entries were brief at first, just a sentence or two about things I noticed or felt, but they gave me a way to process my experiences without the filter of Marcus's judgments. Today, he criticized my breakfast eggs for being too runny, then too dry when I made them again. The problem isn't the eggs. Mrs. Martinez from next door asked if I was feeling well. I realized I must look as broken as I feel. Remembered today that I used to sing while doing housework. When did I stop? Why did I let someone else's discomfort silence my joy? Writing these observations down made me see patterns I'd been too close to recognize. Marcus's complaints weren't random. They were systematic, designed to keep me off balance and constantly doubting myself. His anger wasn't proportional to my supposed failures. It was consistent regardless of what I did or didn't do. His treatment of me wasn't based on love or concern. It was about control, pure and simple. I began testing small boundaries. When Marcus left his dishes in the sink with the obvious expectation that I'd clean them, I left them there. When he dropped his dirty clothes beside the hamper instead of inside it, I stepped around them without picking them up. When he complained about dinner being late because I'd had to work an extra hour, I simply said, I did the best I could with the time I had, instead of apologizing profusely and promising to do better. These tiny acts of self-preservation felt revolutionary after months of complete submission. Marcus noticed, of course, and his irritation was immediate and obvious. But something had shifted in how I received his anger. Instead of absorbing it like a sponge, instead of letting it convince me that I was failing as a person, I began to see it for what it was. His problem, not mine. You're getting lazy, he said one evening, surveying the living room where I'd left my book and reading glasses on the coffee table. This place is starting to look like a dump. 6 months ago, those words would have sent me scrambling to clean everything in sight while apologizing for my slovenliness. Now, I looked around the room with clear eyes and saw one book and a pair of glasses on an otherwise clean surface. The disconnect between his dramatic language and the minor reality was almost laughable. I'll put them away before I go to bed, I said calmly, not moving to address the crisis immediately. Marcus stared at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. He was accustomed to instant compliance, to criticism that resulted in immediate action and groveling apologies. My calm response seemed to confuse him, throw off his rhythm of attack and submission. For the first time in months, I felt something that had been missing from my life, a sense of my own agency. I was making choices, small ones but real ones, about how to respond to unreasonable demands. I was remembering that I had options beyond absolute compliance or explosive rebellion. The old Denise was still in there, buried but not dead. The woman who'd raised a child alone, who'd worked multiple jobs without complaint, who'd held her family together through impossible circumstances. That woman had faced bigger challenges than an ungrateful adult son, and she'd survived them all. But this time, survival wouldn't be enough. This time I was going to do more than just endure. I was going to reclaim my life, one small choice at a time. It wasn't anger driving me anymore. Anger was too exhausting, too focused on what others were doing wrong. This was something quieter, but more powerful. It was determination. And for the first time in months, I felt hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The transformation wasn't visible from the outside, at least not at first. I still moved through the house quietly, still avoided unnecessary confrontations, still worked my shifts at the gift shop with the same steady reliability I'd always shown. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer simply surviving Marcus's presence in my life. I was studying it, understanding it, preparing for something I couldn't yet name. I started paying attention to his patterns with the detached curiosity of someone observing a stranger. Marcus was most aggressive when he'd had a bad day job hunting, when rejection emails arrived, or when potential employers didn't call back. His cruelty toward me seemed to increase in direct proportion to his own feelings of powerlessness in the world beyond our house. I wasn't his mother during these episodes. I was his audience, the one person guaranteed to absorb his frustration without fighting back or leaving. This realization was both painful and oddly comforting. Painful because it confirmed that my son saw me as nothing more than an emotional dumping ground. Comforting because it meant his behavior truly had nothing to do with my worth as a person or my failures as a mother. I was simply convenient, available, and conditioned not to defend myself. I began making small changes that felt enormous to me but were barely noticeable to Marcus. I started eating my meals at the kitchen table instead of standing at the counter, setting my plate down with the quiet dignity of someone who belonged in her own home. When Marcus made snide comments about my food choices or eating habits, I continued chewing normally, instead of immediately defending myself or changing my behavior. "That's a lot of bread for someone your age," he said one evening, watching me butter a dinner roll. "Carbs turn to fat faster when your metabolism slows down." 6 months ago, I would have immediately put the roll down, apologized for my poor judgment, and promised to be more careful about my diet. Now, I took a deliberate bite and said simply, "I'm having dinner." The response was so mild, so matter-of-fact, that Marcus seemed momentarily thrown off balance. He was accustomed to my responses being either defensive or submissive, not this calm acknowledgement that dismissed his right to comment on my food choices. I could see him searching for a way to escalate the criticism, but my lack of engagement had removed his ammunition. I started reaching out tentatively to the outside world, testing whether relationships I'd neglected might be worth rebuilding. I called my old friend Patricia from church, the first personal phone call I'd made in months that wasn't about work or necessary household business. My hands shook as I dialed, terrified that she wouldn't want to hear from me, that too much time had passed, that I'd become too broken to be good company. "Denise!" Patricia's voice carried genuine warmth and surprise. "I was just thinking about you. How are you, honey? We've missed you at services." The simple acknowledgement that I'd been missed, that my absence had been noticed and regretted, brought tears to my eyes. I'd convinced myself that I was easily forgettable, that people had better things to do than wonder about a quiet woman who'd simply stopped showing up to places she used to go. We talked for 20 minutes about small things. Patricia's grandchildren, changes at the church, mutual friends I'd lost touch with, normal conversation between two women who'd known each other for years, sharing the comfortable rhythms of friendship that I'd forgotten existed. When Marcus walked through the kitchen during our call, he shot me a look of obvious displeasure, but I turned slightly away and continued talking. "We should have coffee soon," Patricia suggested as our conversation wound down. "I'd love to catch up properly. And I want to hear about how Marcus is doing." The mention of Marcus sent a familiar spike of anxiety through me, but I pushed it aside. "I'd like that," I said, surprised to discover I meant it. "Coffee sounds wonderful." After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen feeling something I'd almost forgotten. Connection. Another human being had reached across the isolation Marcus had created around me and reminded me that I existed outside his judgment, that people remembered me as someone worth knowing and spending time with. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I took a long, hot bath with the bathroom door locked, soaking in water that was exactly the temperature I preferred without worrying about whether Marcus might need the bathroom or object to the sound of running water. I brought my Bible with me, reading favorite passages while candlelight flickered against the tiles I'd chosen when we first moved into this house, when it was still truly mine. The words felt like water after a long drought. Verses about strength in times of trouble, about the importance of treating others with dignity, about standing firm in your convictions even when the world around you suggests you should compromise your values. I'd read these same passages hundreds of times before, but tonight they felt personal, urgent, meant specifically for me in this exact moment. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, Marcus was waiting in the hallway, his expression dark with the particular anger he reserved for times when I did something without his permission or approval. "What's all this about?" he demanded, gesturing toward the bathroom where the scent of lavender bath salts still lingered in the air. "Running water for an hour, lighting candles like you're at some spa? You know utilities aren't free, right?" The old me would have immediately apologized, explained that I'd been quick as possible, promised not to waste money on such indulgences again. The new me looked at my son, this man who'd been living rent-free in my house for months while criticizing my every action, and felt something I hadn't experienced in far too long: righteous indignation. "I took a bath," I said simply. "In my own bathroom, in my own house." Marcus's eyes narrowed at the emphasis on my own, recognizing a challenge he wasn't prepared for. "Your house? I thought we'd established who's actually keeping this place running financially." "We've established that you contribute money," I replied, keeping my voice level despite the rapid beating of my heart. "That doesn't make you the owner of my basic human dignity." The words hung in the air between us, bold and clear and impossible to take back. I'd drawn a line I hadn't known I was capable of drawing, claimed territory I'd been surrendering inch by inch for months. Marcus stared at me like I'd slapped him, clearly shocked that his compliant, apologetic mother had been replaced by someone willing to state uncomfortable truths. For a moment, I thought he might explode, might unleash the full force of his anger in ways that would terrify us both. Instead, he stepped closer, using his height and bulk to loom over me in the narrow hallway, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Don't forget who you're talking to," he said, his breath hot against my face. "Don't forget who's really in charge here." The threat was unmistakable, meant to send me scurrying back to my room like a scolded child. But standing there in my own hallway, clean from my own bath, supported by the prayers I'd whispered in my own bathtub, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Fearlessness. Not because I wasn't afraid, I was terrified, but because I was more afraid of disappearing completely than I was of facing Marcus's anger. More afraid of becoming invisible in my own life than of dealing with whatever consequences might come from refusing to remain invisible. "I haven't forgotten anything," I said quietly. "I remember exactly who I'm talking to. The question is whether you remember who you're talking to." I stepped around him and walked to my bedroom, closing the door behind me with the gentle firmness of someone who belonged exactly where she was. My hands were shaking, my heart was racing, but I felt more like myself than I had in months. The confrontation was far from over. In fact, I suspected it was just beginning. But for the first time since this nightmare started, I wasn't facing it as a victim. I was facing it as a woman who'd remembered she had choices, who'd decided that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was scary, especially if the fight was scary. The explosion came 3 days later, triggered by something so small it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so terrifying. I was reading my Bible in the living room, not hiding it, not whispering prayers in locked rooms, but simply sitting in my own chair, reading words that brought me comfort. The afternoon light was perfect, streaming through windows I'd washed myself in a house I'd helped purchase, and for the first time in months I felt truly at peace. Marcus burst through the front door like a storm, his face already twisted with the kind of rage that had become too familiar in recent months. Another job interview had gone badly, another rejection email had arrived, another day had passed without the validation he felt the world owed him. But instead of finding his usual target, a woman too broken to fight back, he found someone different. "Still reading those fairy tales?" he said, his voice carrying that particular venom he reserved for anything connected to my faith. "Still pretending some invisible man in the sky is going to solve your problems?" I looked up from my Bible, marked my place carefully with a ribbon bookmark, and met his eyes with a calmness that surprised us both. I'm reading in my living room, in my house. The emphasis on my was deliberate, and Marcus caught it immediately. His face flushed red with anger that went beyond frustration about job hunting or financial stress. This was fury at having his authority questioned by someone he'd systematically trained to submit without question. Your house? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Only cruelty and the particular satisfaction of someone about to deliver a blow he knew would devastate his target. Let me tell you something about your house, Mom. I've been looking at the mortgage documents. Did you know your name isn't even on the deed? Dad made sure of that before he left. Legally, you have no more right to this place than a squatter. The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing my breath and sending ice through my veins. All these years I'd believed I was a homeowner, that the house I'd worked 3 jobs to maintain was actually mine. But even as the shock reverberated through my system, even as I felt the familiar urge to crumble under the weight of this new humiliation, something inside me held firm. Then it's a good thing I've been keeping receipts, I said quietly, surprised by my own steadiness. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every repair and improvement I've paid for over the years. I may not be on the deed, but I have documentation of every dollar I've invested in this property. Marcus's confident sneer faltered slightly. He'd expected complete devastation, the kind of emotional collapse that would send me fleeing to my room in tears. Instead, he was facing someone who'd apparently given thought to practical realities he'd assumed I was too broken to consider. You think receipts matter? You think some part-time job at a gift shop gives you any real claim to anything? His voice was rising now, loud enough that I worried about the neighbors hearing. I could have you out of here tomorrow if I wanted. One phone call to the right people and you'd be living in your car. Maybe, I replied, still holding my Bible like an anchor. But you'd have to explain to those same people why you've been living here rent-free for months while threatening the woman who's been paying your expenses. The conversation was spinning beyond Marcus's control, moving into territory where his threats carried less weight than he'd expected. I could see him searching for ways to regain the upper hand, to find the words that would reduce me back to the terrified, apologetic woman I'd been just weeks ago. That's when he crossed a line that changed everything. Maybe it's time I helped you meet your God faster, he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper as he stepped closer. Since you're so eager to pray all the time, maybe I should give you something to really pray about. The threat was unmistakable, and for the first time in our entire confrontation, genuine fear spiked through my newfound courage. But even as my hands trembled, even as my heart hammered against my ribs, I didn't look away. I'd spent months teaching him that intimidation worked, that threats could control my behavior. Today, that lesson ended. Are you threatening me, Marcus? I asked, my voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. In my living room, in front of windows where neighbors can see. Are you actually threatening your mother with physical violence? Something in my tone seemed to penetrate the red haze of his anger. For just a moment, he looked like the confused little boy he'd once been, uncertain about what line he'd just crossed. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by doubled-down fury that felt dangerous in ways our previous confrontations hadn't. I'm telling you the truth about your situation, he snarled. I'm explaining reality to someone who's clearly lost touch with it. You're an old woman with no money, no real home, no family except me. And if you keep pushing, you might not even have that. He grabbed his keys from the coffee table with violent force and stormed toward the door, but turned back before leaving. Think about what I said while I'm gone. Think about how easy it would be for me to make your life even worse than it already is. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the windows, leaving me alone in a silence that felt both terrifying and profound. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my Bible, but I was still holding it. My heart was racing, but I was still breathing. My world had been threatened with complete destruction, but I was still here. That's when I heard it, a tentative knocking at my front door. For a moment, panic flooded through me. Had Marcus come back? Had he forgotten something and returned to continue the confrontation? But the knock was too gentle, too polite to be his. I opened the door to find Mrs. Elena Martinez from next door, a woman in her 70s who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. Her face was creased with concern, and she was holding her phone in one hand like she'd been in the middle of making a call. Denise, honey, she said softly. I couldn't help but hear raised voices. Are you all right? Should I call someone? The simple question, asked with genuine concern by someone who barely knew me but cared enough to check, broke something open inside my chest. Here was proof that the isolation Marcus had created around me wasn't complete, that other people had been paying attention even when I thought I was invisible. I don't know, I said honestly, surprised by my own directness. I think I might need help, but I don't know what kind. Elena stepped closer, her weathered hand touching my arm with the gentle authority of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize crisis when she saw it. I heard some of what he said to you. That young man has no right to speak to you that way, son or no son. And those threats? She shook her head firmly. That's not how family treats family. I don't know what to do, I admitted, the words feeling like both confession and prayer. He's my son, but I'm scared of him. I'm scared in my own home. Elena nodded like she'd heard similar stories before, like my situation wasn't as unique or shameful as I'd believed. Have you talked to anyone else about this? Family? Friends? Someone at your church? I shook my head, feeling the weight of months of isolation pressing down on me. I was too embarrassed, too ashamed that I couldn't handle my own son. Honey, Elena said gently, there's no shame in asking for help when someone is hurting you, and there's definitely no shame in protecting yourself from someone who's threatening you, even if that someone shares your blood. She pulled a small card from her purse, white with blue lettering and an official-looking seal. This is the number for the domestic violence hotline. I know that might sound extreme, but what I heard through those walls, that was abuse, Denise. And abuse doesn't stop getting worse just because you hope it will. I took the card with trembling fingers, staring at words that seemed to apply to other people's lives, not mine. Domestic violence happened to other women, younger women with boyfriends who hit them, wives whose husbands came home drunk and angry. It didn't happen to mothers whose adult children had simply lost their way. But even as I tried to rationalize away what Elena was suggesting, I knew she was right. The threats, the intimidation, the systematic destruction of my sense of safety and dignity, these weren't normal family conflicts that could be resolved through better communication or increased patience. This was abuse, plain and simple. I recorded some of what he said, Elena continued quietly, from my side of the wall, when his voice got loud enough to be threatening. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but when someone's clearly being hurt, she met my eyes directly. If you decide you want to do something about this situation, if you decide you want to protect yourself, you won't have to do it alone. For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope backed by practical action. Not just the hope that things might somehow get better on their own, but hope that there were people willing to help me make them better. Systems in place to protect women like me. Options beyond enduring or running away. I looked down at the card in my hands, then back at Elena's kind, determined face. What do I do? The phone call I made that evening changed everything. Not immediately. Real change rarely happens in an instant. But it set in motion a series of events that would eventually give me back my life, my home, and most importantly, my sense of worth as a human being deserving of basic respect and safety. The domestic violence counselor who answered the hotline spoke to me with a gentleness I hadn't experienced in months, treating my situation as serious and my fears as valid without requiring me to justify why I'd waited so long to seek help. Her name was Sarah, and she had the calm voice of someone who'd guided many women through similar crises. Someone who understood that courage comes in many forms and doesn't always look like what people expect. You don't have to decide everything tonight, she told me during that first conversation. We're going to take this one step at a time, at your pace, with your safety as the top priority. But I want you to know that what you've described, the threats, the intimidation, the financial manipulation, these are serious forms of abuse, and you have legal options available. Legal options. The phrase felt both terrifying and liberating. I'd spent so many months convincing myself that my situation was a family matter, something that should be handled privately between a mother and son. The idea that outside authorities might take Marcus's behavior seriously, might actually do something to protect me, seemed almost too good to believe. Sarah helped me create a safety plan, Practical steps to take if Marcus's behavior escalated, people to call, places to go if I needed to leave quickly. She explained my rights as a tenant. Regardless of whose name was on the deed, I had legal protections as someone who'd been living in the house and contributing to its expenses. And she connected me with a lawyer who specialized in domestic violence cases and worked with women who couldn't afford expensive legal fees. But perhaps most importantly, she helped me understand that I wasn't alone. There were other women my age dealing with similar situations. Children who'd become abusers, family members who used financial leverage to control and intimidate, people who exploited love and loyalty as weapons. My shame began to dissolve as I realized that what was happening to me wasn't a reflection of my failure as a mother, but rather evidence of a larger problem that affected thousands of families. The legal process moved more quickly than I'd expected. With Elena's recording as evidence and my documentation of Marcus's threats, the lawyer was able to obtain a temporary restraining order within a week. The day the sheriff's deputy served Marcus with the papers was the day I finally understood what justice could look like. I was at work when it happened, but Elena called me immediately afterward to describe the scene. Marcus had returned home in his usual aggressive mood, probably expecting to find me cowering in my bedroom, ready to apologize for standing up to him. Instead, he found an official representative of the legal system waiting to inform him that his behavior had consequences, that threatening and intimidating his mother was a crime regardless of their family relationship. "You should have seen his face," Elena told me, her voice filled with satisfaction. Complete shock, like he couldn't believe someone was actually going to hold him accountable for his behavior. The deputy was very professional, very clear about what the restraining order meant, and what would happen if Marcus violated it. Marcus had 30 days to find alternative housing and remove his belongings from my house. During that time, he was prohibited from contacting me directly, from coming within 500 feet of my workplace, and from making any threats or intimidating gestures. If he violated any part of the order, he would be arrested immediately. The first few days after the restraining order was served were tense. Marcus complied with the legal requirements. He found a temporary place to stay and began moving his belongings. But I could feel his anger radiating through every interaction, even the indirect ones. He left passive-aggressive notes about household items he claimed belonged to him, made pointed comments to Elena about ungrateful mothers who turned their backs on their children, generally tried to maintain his narrative that I was the problem and he was the victim. But his version of events had lost its power over me. With the support of the counseling service, with Elena's friendship and Patricia's renewed presence in my life, with the practical protection of legal documentation, I could see Marcus's manipulation for what it was. The desperate flailing of someone who'd lost his ability to control another person's reality. The most profound moment came during his final week in the house. I was in the kitchen making dinner, cooking what I wanted to eat. At the time, I chose to eat it, without considering anyone else's preferences, when Marcus appeared in the doorway. For a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered, confused and maybe even sorry for how things had deteriorated between us. "Mom," he said quietly, "I think maybe we both said things we didn't mean. Maybe we can work this out without involving all these outside people." 6 months ago, that tentative olive branch would have had me rushing to reconcile, apologizing for my part in our conflict, agreeing to forget everything that had happened if it meant having my son back. But I'd learned too much about the patterns of abuse to be fooled by temporary gentleness. I'd heard too many stories from other women about abusers who became sweet and apologetic when faced with real consequences, only to return to their harmful behavior once the immediate pressure was removed. "I love you, Marcus," I said, meaning every word. But love doesn't mean accepting threats or intimidation. It doesn't mean allowing someone to make me afraid in my own home, even if that someone is my son. His face hardened immediately, the mask of contrition falling away to reveal the anger that had been simmering underneath. "You're choosing strangers over your own family. You're choosing some imaginary god over your real son." "I'm choosing myself," I replied simply. "I'm choosing to be treated with basic human dignity. I'm choosing to live without fear. Those aren't choices I should have to defend to anyone, including you." Marcus left that day without another word, taking the last of his belongings and the cold atmosphere that had poisoned my home for months. The silence that followed his departure was nothing like the oppressive quiet I'd endured while tiptoeing around his moods. This was peaceful silence, the blessed calm of a space where I could breathe freely again. The house felt enormous at first. Rooms that had seemed cramped and tense when Marcus dominated them now stretched out like possibilities waiting to be rediscovered. I walked through each space slowly, reclaiming territory that had always been mine, but hadn't felt like mine in far too long. I moved my Bible back to the coffee table in the living room. I hung my favorite inspirational quotes on walls that had seemed too hostile for such gentle reminders. I started humming again while doing housework, filling the air with melodies that had been silenced for months. Most importantly, I started inviting people back into my life. Patricia came for coffee, and we talked for hours about everything I'd been afraid to share during my isolation. Other church friends visited, bringing casseroles and conversation and the reminder that community exists for exactly these kinds of crises. Elena became not just a neighbor, but a true friend, someone who'd proven that speaking up for others is one of the most important things we can do. 6 months later, I received a letter from Marcus. He was living across town, had found steady employment, and wrote that he'd been thinking about everything that happened. The letter was neither an apology nor a request for reconciliation, just an acknowledgement that our relationship had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. I read it once, then put it in a drawer with other correspondence I wasn't ready to fully process. Maybe someday we'd find a way to be mother and son again. But it would have to be a relationship built on mutual respect rather than the toxic dynamic we'd fallen into. I wasn't holding my breath, but I wasn't closing the door entirely either. What I had learned, through months of pain and the difficult process of reclaiming my life, was that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's enabling. That respect must flow both ways in any healthy relationship, regardless of blood ties. That speaking up for yourself isn't selfish or unchristian, but rather an act of honoring the dignity God gave you. I had learned that my faith was stronger than I'd realized, that it could survive being attacked and suppressed and used as a weapon against me. That prayer wasn't just something I did in church or in desperate moments, but a constant conversation with a presence that never abandoned me, even when I felt most alone. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to choose dignity over peace, truth over comfort, self-respect over avoiding conflict. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in your own destruction, even when that refusal disappoints or angers people you care about. Today, I live in my house as its rightful resident. I practice my faith openly and joyfully. I maintain friendships that feed my soul and contribute to my community in ways that feel meaningful. I am, at 56, finally learning what it means to live without fear, not because life has become perfectly safe, but because I've remembered that I have choices about how to respond to whatever challenges arise. I learned that sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths, and that dignity, once reclaimed, is a light that can never again be completely extinguished.